Good morning! I am WaywornWyrm, and welcome to my channel. And today we are going to be doing the second part of the second rise of the Roman Empire, called the Troubled Emperor. Today we make such a large deal when talking about the Bologna Conventions, where the rules of modern warfare, among other international laws, were laid down, and we act like before that series of conventions in the mid-1900s, there were no international laws at all, let alone international laws regarding warfare. The Roman-Lombard War over Taranto from 769 to 771 is a great example of how wrong that thinking is. By the time the war finally ended, most of southern Italy was under Roman control, and yet they gave almost all of it back at the end of the war, because the claim they had pressed at the start of the war was just for Taranto and the surrounding countryside. In fact, the series of wars that the Romans waged against the Lombards and the papacy serve as a great example of international laws regarding warfare existing back in what we generally refer to as the Dark Ages. International law may have been informal and more of a gentleman's agreement among various independent rulers, but considering the number of coalitions that seem to have temporarily formed against nations seen as belligerent beyond normal bounds, such as the Roman Empire in this time frame, I would argue that such agreements had just as much teeth as modern international law has. In the present day, international law only applies as long as there's other nations willing to enforce them with various means, such as war or sanctions. Historical texts from throughout Europe and the Near East mention various coalitions peppered liberally through them. But it seems that almost every time they formed, the nation they formed against refrained from warfare for a decade or two until the coalition eventually just fell apart. So it's unknown how serious these coalitions actually were. Some historians argue that these coalitions were defensive in nature, and that is a large part of the reason why they're able to hold together, as well as why they almost never actually banded together for a war. Other historians claim that they were basically offensive in nature, where they would draw a line in the sand, and if the nation they had allied against crossed that line, they would pile on. But the historical data for that assumption I found is quite thin. Ryan. During this time, it is customary to refer to them as the Byzantine Empire, or the Byzantine period of the Roman Empire. During this several hundred-year stretch, they were not in control of several provinces that are seen as integral to the Roman Empire, and as such are not referred to as such. Excerpt from a draft of International Law and Its Basis in the Middle Ages, a look at early development of international law predating the Bologna Conventions, by doctoral student Ryan Martin, unpublished. Konstantinos rubbed his hands over a fire in the brazier in his tent. His mud-stained purple greatcloak was hanging nearby, drying. His men were surrounding the town of Salerno, and the hill on which the Castello di Erici was held. It was January, and he had spent the better part of a year on campaign. More than that, word had recently reached him that Strategos Michael the Fat had entered Byzantium ahead of his army, and would be taking a short vacation in the city before moving on to join the other themes here in Italy. Michael the Fat would be vacationing in the city. This blasted castle on the hill was keeping his men at bay. There were less than 500 men between the castle and the town that were holding back his almost 5,000 from moving in the town freely. His irritation felt formless, and was at least partially weather-driven. It wasn't that it was cold. It wasn't all that cold, after all. Most Januaries in Byzantium, especially in the northern part of the city, would be much colder. No, it was that it was raining more than it wasn't, and there was no respite from it. Well, no, that wasn't true. There was respite to it. That damned castle was respite. Romanos! He barked out. A few seconds later, Romanos entered the tent and looked at his emperor. Yes? He asked simply. Prepare the men! We assault the town and the castle in first light. Our flanks will charge around the hill and take the town, and our center will charge up the hill with our heavy infantry providing cover with their shields. Konstantinos said sharply. He was not in the mood to be questioned or talked out of his course of action. Romanos, sensing that now would not be a good time to contradict his emperor, bowed low and said, It will be done, my liege. And with that, he smartly turned on his heel and left the tent to call the officers together. For the next few hours, there would be many meetings throughout the Roman camp, and they would prepare for their third battle. Konstantinos sat in the main hall of the Castello di Arci, where he was temporarily keeping his court. The castle and town had fallen a week and a half before, and the towns of Nocera and Ersino had fallen mere days later. Now his men were moving on the town of Sarno and its small castle to prepare a fourth assault. Today, he was holding petitions from his Italian subjects, at least those who could travel through the Lombard-held land to meet him. Most of the subjects today had been from Neapoli, as it was very close and most of the way was held by Romans. One of his people had told him the next subject was one such person. He was a wealthy patrician from Neapoli, and was rather prominent in the area as such. Let in the next one, he intoned, waving his hands toward the door at the far end. Two of the guards flanking the doors stepped to the side and opened them, allowing a tall man with olive-colored skin and brown hair to walk through. As soon as he was out of the way of the doors, the guards closed them and stepped back into their previously held spot. The man walked forward in the confident, arrogant way of a man who is used to be taken seriously and has news that will displace one of the few people he considers superior to himself. Once he had reached the appropriate distance, he bowed and waited for the emperor to bid him to begin. When Konstantinos had given such permission, the man began his story. Your Majesty, I come with demands for justice and recompense. Your protestator, the Strategos Romanos of Epiros, was a guest in my house during a stay in Neapolis he had not long ago. He stayed only one night, but during that night he raped and beat my daughter. I demand justice for my daughter and recompense if she is with child now. The man stood tall and firm in the face of his emperor and the accusations he made. Konstantinos listened to the man, and then looked over to the side of the room where Romanos was. He ushered Romanos closer. Is this true, Romanos? The words came out almost conversationally, as if you were asking if Romanos had supped somewhere nice, rather than stood accused of raping and beating a young woman. Romanos stood in front of his emperor and replied, trying to keep the rage out of his voice. It most certainly is not. Let me amend that. I did stay at this man's house for a night, and I saw his daughter at dinner, but I neither beat nor raped her. Konstantinos shifted his gaze back to the man, casting a withering look at him. Did you see Romanos beating or raping your daughter? The man shifted slightly. This was not going quite as he had pictured it. No. But I know my daughter. She was beaten. I saw the bruises. And she would not lie about something like this. Romanos was the only guest in my house. There's no one else who could have done it. I have known Romanos and his wife for many years. This accusation is most out of character for him. No, I will not believe the words of a young woman that fly so much in the face of what I know about my strategos. She is lying. She must be. Begone now, you fool, lest I throw you in prison. The man nearly ran out of the room at that, hastily bowing, both as he started and again as he left the room. Konstantinos looked back at Romanos. You better not have lied to me, Romanos. If this matter ever comes back before me again, you'll not be left off so lightly. Romanos bowed and went back to where he had been before. That is it! I'm done holding petitions for the day. Tell any of the remaining people to be gone. Konstantinos looked over the land he could see from the top of one of the hills overlooking Taranto. Capturing the city was the entire point of the war, and here he was 2 years into the war, and the Lombards still controlled it. The Romans controlled most of the land surrounding Taranto, but so far they had not really been able to lay siege to the city. A small force made up from the theme of Sicily was now setting up to lay siege to the city. The Anatolian theme had joined them in Italy and had taken the county of Bari and had moved on to Apulia. His main force had been reduced down to 3,500 men after several battles with the main Lombard army led by King Desiderius, and was now sieging some towns in Benvenido in the mountains. As he continued to look at the city, a courier rode up to him. When the horseman came close, he stopped his horse and jumped down, running to the emperor. It was clearly something very important, since the young man was ignoring all protocol. "Your Majesty!" he yelled, clearly out of breath, and the horse was snorting as if it was out of breath as well. Konstantinos turned back to the young man. "Yes?" "Your wife!" The boy stopped to breathe deep a few times. "Spit it out, man!" Konstantinos roared. "Smallpox has broken out throughout Thrace. Your wife, she has smallpox. I'm sorry, my liege." The words tumbled out of his mouth. Konstantinos dismissed the boy, and as he rode away, the emperor of the Roman Empire, the ruler of more people than any other ruler in the world, and here he was on campaign, having reduced the armies of one of the largest nations to almost nothing. This man collapsed. His legs turned to jelly. In spite of all of his achievements, all of his grandeur, all of his majesty, in spite of all of that, his wife was stricken low by a miasma, and she was likely to die, or at least spend the rest of her life disfigured. She would have scars from the pox all over. She would never look or possibly be the same again. Thank you. That was the second part of the second rise of the Roman Empire. Tune in tomorrow for another installation of The Art of War by Sun Tzu.